Hey, financial freedom seekers, Simon Dixon here, and today we're going to be talking about freedom, FUD, and attacks on Bitcoin. There's been a lot going on, so we're going to jump straight in with some of the biggest attacks on freedom, Bitcoin, and fear, uncertainty, and doubt that is being spread out there in these times of massive change. So firstly, let's begin with freedom of speech. I haven't given much commentary on the situation with Twitter and Elon Musk, so I'm just going to say a few words before we go through attacks on financial freedom and also colonial freedom attacks. So let's start with freedom of speech. So I think that it's pretty interesting that since Elon announced the takeover of Twitter, that most of the objections have not really been around whether taking a company that was public, private, and having less scrutiny and less accountability to the public, what the impact that will be. Now, what's interesting is the EU has really been attacking it, not in terms of the fact that it's going from public to private and whether that changes everything in terms of accountability and censorship. So giving a private person the ability to control it with less accountability, versus actually what the main complaint from the EU has been is that it will give the world more freedom of speech. And so these attacks on Twitter and Elon, stating that Twitter has been doing lots of work in order to combat fake news and misinformation, like the Bloomberg article on El Salvador that we will be covering today, I personally, faced with the choice of two, would much rather have a platform that allows people to express their views and then videos like this be uncensored so that people can scrutinize and judge over time whether it was fake news, whether we were wrong, whether we were right, so that we can engage in freedom of speech rather than agendas at the top stating what topics we can talk about. Now, I don't know about you, but during the pandemic, I would much rather have had more content that I could consume on whether I should be able to be more healthy, be more fit, build my immunity, that drove me to getting back in shape and getting in the gym right now, versus why I should inject myself. Now, I'm not saying which side is right, which side is wrong, but I would have loved to have had content on both sides instead of being bombarded with being told that if I don't inject myself, I'm a murderer and I'm immoral, and there's a death counter on the television telling us how many people I'm murdering if I do or don't inject myself. Personally, I would much rather today be able to see a lot more content on the impact of NATO and the International Monetary Fund's policies on the massive amounts of debt that Ukraine took on from the International Monetary Fund, and also the policies around NATO, versus just being told that there's this dictator that is the new Hitler, that is causing all of these problems in the world, and just a one-sided version of the story. Let me be really clear. The fact that innocent people all around the world are dying as a result of leaders and their policies is completely wrong. But I also think it's completely wrong that we're only given one side of the story, completely distorting the narrative, just like we did during the pandemic, where it was distorting the narrative around whether we should inject ourselves or not. I personally believe that freedom of speech is something worth fighting for, and I would much rather that the internet judges those and whether they're fake news or fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and all those things. So now, whether Elon controlling Twitter and owning Twitter, and his policy of attacking bots that are scamming people. And please be careful. I'm not going to message you on Twitter or Telegram or any other place or WhatsApp, despite all the idiots and people that want to scam you in this comment section, asking you to contact them on WhatsApp and then asking you to send them some Bitcoin and stuff. It's not me. They're pretending to be me. But attacks on bots and then bringing people back to the platform that was censored from the platform. If that vision is fulfilled, then the EU attacks on freedom of speech, I believe, are something that we should be putting more attention to, and hopefully that does not result in more censorship in this channel and in this video. So freedom of speech has been a real topic to discussion. The other thing worth looking at is also attacks on financial freedom. So the EU has been getting very, very aggressive around the fact that Twitter accounts might be re-enabled and people might be able to talk and have a platform where they didn't have a platform. At the same time, they're getting very aggressive around the financial freedom concepts, by attacking proof of work versus things like proof of stake. So the EU has come along and said, if Ethereum can change itself from proof of work to proof of stake, then so should Bitcoin. And therefore, we should try and attack the price and manipulate the markets in order to try and suppress it. Well, firstly, the Bank of England tried to do that, and George Soros became one of the richest people in the world when it bet against the Bank of England. So good luck. If you're a fiat thinker, then you will see this as a reason to use that fear, uncertainty, and doubt to potentially sell Bitcoin. If you are a Bitcoin thinker, then any attacks on Bitcoin to manipulate the price could be seen as a way of accumulating more Bitcoin with your fiat, and ending up with a bigger Bitcoin stack when the manipulation breaks down, especially when money printing causes the demise and destruction of many of the fiat currencies, just like it has with all of the 720 fiat currencies that have been studied since the 1700s that have an average lifespan of 27 years. Anyway, I digress. Proof of work versus proof of stake. Check out previous videos where I talked about EU attacks on Bitcoin and the importance of proof of work. The fact that Ethereum can move from proof of work to proof of stake is directly proportionate to the person that created it suggesting that that should be a good idea, which is very similar to central banking policy. In order to think of central banking with a democracy, you can think of Ethereum more like that. You have a leader that suggests policy, and then there is a democratic process, and then it switches to proof of stake, where those that own the most ETH get the biggest amount of say in the network. Proof of work is the reason that we have a world's best shot at achieving digital hard sound money. Proof of work is the reason why Bitcoin cannot be changed easily, why it is not like central banking, and why it is ultra important to expend money on electricity versus the atrocities that happen in the central banking world that were covered in previous videos that lead to poverty, war, and people dropping weapons of mass destruction that are combated by financial weapons of mass destruction as a result of those leaders that control the majority of those fiat currency proof of stake networks that pay pitiful interest because those banks have a monopoly on money creation process. And so trying to turn Bitcoin into fiat currency, firstly, nobody has such control, which is why it has many of the commodity-like features, just like a commodity like gold. Now, the reason and the difference between gold and silver, think of the analogy, proof of work versus proof of stake. Silver was useful as a medium of exchange, but those that used it as a store of value rather than gold even led to the destruction of countries like China, who had, a depressed century as a result of being the last country to remove itself from a silver standard and move itself over to a gold standard. That had disastrous consequences on that country, if you're thinking about it in the long term. Now, if we're thinking about fear, uncertainty, doubt, and speculation, and fiat thinking, and investing in something to short-term earn more fiat, then you might fall for all these different attacks on the thing. But for me, an attack on proof of work is an attack on the opportunity for the world to experience financial freedom, because they get the opportunity to exit the traditional financial system. And that is a very, very important mechanism that, fortunately, no matter what politicians do, no matter what corporations do, no matter what individuals might say whether Bitcoin should convert to proof of work versus proof of stake, proof of work is protecting the properties of Bitcoin, making it so different from every other cryptocurrency, and its ability to serve as digital hard sound money. Now, just like with gold, silver can have a role, but silver is not gold, because silver is a lot easier to increase its supply versus gold. Gold, no matter what has happened to the price, has led to almost a maximum, a cap, a 2% increase per year, which has led it to be in the greatest store of value, versus silver. When the price changes, you can increase its supply, which then suppresses its price, and why it was a disaster for those on the silver standard versus the gold standard. And the problem with gold as well is that the fact that fiat currency was created to solve the problem of the transportability issue of gold and the auditability issue of gold, because nobody really knows what gold is held at these different banks, custodians, and central banks. So the fact that gold is so hard to transport globally, it ends up being stored, and those that want to own it put it in a custodian as an individual because it's hard to store. Those central banks like Venezuela that stored it in another central bank, to the demise of their country when there's political disagreements, start to experience the pain. And those that store it in their own central bank start to realize a degree of freedom, but the individual and most people find it very, very hard to build the infrastructure and securities of a central bank in order to protect their gold. Because of that, firstly, it's hard to audit. It doesn't have a blockchain because it's physical. And secondly, it's very hard to transport. So everybody ended up depositing at a bank, a custodian, or a central bank, in which case they issued a receipt called fiat currency. And because it's not auditable, then banks created more receipts for gold than existed and increased the supply. And then people started to use these receipts for gold as good as legal tender because it actually supported the ability to transport gold around the world for international domestic process. So it was a great innovation for that. But the fact that it debased the gold led to central banks being able to issue ginormous loans that then can be used in order to fund wars, and therefore you have a much, much larger increase in the amount of violence and attacks on other countries in the world, and things like colonialism, which is funded by central banks, which leads to the third attack, which is colonial attacks that we are experiencing right now. So, the crime of the century, from my perspective, occurred after World War II, which is when the most powerful central bank in the world, as it were, the Federal Reserve, in the decline of the British Empire, negotiated and sat around a table in Bretton Woods and made the dollar, because of it had the most economic growth at the time, and made the dollar the world reserve currency on a promise that it would be backed by gold. And that promise was reneged in 1971, which meant that the dollar was able to excessively print itself in order to fund more wars. And these colonial attacks that we have seen through the International Monetary Fund, where it was also created at Bretton Woods, it made itself the world reserve currency backed upon a promise that it would back itself by the dollar. Everybody else made itself tradable to the dollar, the 32 central banks. And then the IMF got dollars around the world through the International Monetary Fund, which to me was a colonial attack on those countries, just like we are experiencing at the time right now with attacks like previous attacks from France and Europe on countries like Central African Republic. Central African Republic has just made Bitcoin legal tender. I don't have any views on the country and the future growth of this country, but I do know that in the past, the franc, the Central African franc that they had to use was a colonial attack on that country, just like International Monetary Fund debt is a colonial attack on those countries that take IMF loans, that has tied loans, where those dollars end up back in the country that issued the loan in Washington, D.C., where the debt cripples those countries at the same time because based upon a currency that promised it would be backed by gold, that reneged on that agreement and created the atrocities in central banks right now, where more and more money can be printed and created, which is a theft on those that save it. And the reason why we need proof of work as a mechanism to redistribute wealth from those that save in fiat to those that save in hard digital sound money. So going back to the fear, uncertainty and doubt, the final part of this video, I would much rather have freedom of speech so that I can release a video on things like the complete fake news that was released by Bloomberg recently. Bloomberg stated, and Business Insider rehypothecated, a fake news article on the El Salvador Bitcoin Volcano bond. So let me just take some of the misinformation from that article and share it with you right now. So the first thing is it said that not $1 of demand in the Bitcoin Volcano bond is there. Bitfinex and Bank to the Future have had hundreds of millions of pledges and it hasn't been invested yet simply because the bond is not live yet. Why is the bond not live yet? Because it requires new securities laws. And so the country in El Salvador, if you had not noticed, has been busy fighting some of the crime in its country. And the biggest crime that it should also be fighting is International Monetary Fund debt. So this article also focused on the sovereign debt of the country. Now, the sovereign debt is very real. But the Bitcoin Volcano bond is a corporate infrastructure bond. The corporate infrastructure bond that is going to be building out Bitcoin volcano mining based upon volcano geothermal energy from volcanoes from the country's energy producer. So the sovereign debt is separate from the corporate infrastructure bond that makes up the Bitcoin Volcano bond. So that's misinformation 2. Misinformation 3, saying that firstly that there's been no money there. Secondly, that it is going on about the sovereign debt. And thirdly, the IMF attacks on it is obvious. The IMF has had a colonial attack on El Salvador, and the fact that El Salvador, through its previous history, has these levels of indebtedness, and they have a dollar that is being inflated into causing massive poverty in a country like El Salvador, is the exact reason why the IMF is doing a colonial attack on Bitcoin as legal tender. Bitcoin as legal tender gives the individual the opportunity to free itself from any of the inflation that may be experienced in the long term over their savings by the way it is designed and by proof of work. Now, I'm not saying short term there's no volatility. I'm not saying that we're in a bear market. If you have short term needs to meet your expenses, then the dollar will serve that purpose for you. However, it's becoming increasingly harder with inflation to use it as a short-term medium of exchange. And so therefore, the volatility of the dollar with the inflation that is experiencing right now is also a challenge. But when things are priced in the same currency as you transact in, you take less short-term volatility risk. Hence the reason, check out previous videos that I talk about making a very clear distinction between your money for your expenses and your money for your savings. Those that have used the same money for their expenses as the money for their savings suffer severe financial hardship. That's been covered in previous videos as well. So the fact that El Salvador, by policy, is looking at its US dollar debt that is being inflated in a way that it cannot control, and that it may end up, I don't know whether it will end up in default. I know that the finances in El Salvador through IMF debt have been very, very challenging. And so when this happens, if this happens, think about it from the perspective of fiat thinking versus Bitcoin thinking. Having a bunch of dollar debt, borrowing dollars in order to invest in the long-term freedom of the country through currencies, digital hard sound money, is the same strategy that many public companies are using. Not many public, some public companies that are ahead of the curve right now, like the MicroStrategy from MicroSailor, and using, rather than Tesla holding all of their reserves in dollars, they decided to take some of the currency that's been inflated away and put it into a currency that is more speculative but designed to go up in value in the long term as a result of the demand for money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has a fixed supply increasing over time. That is the speculation. Will it increase over time? Well, all I have seen over the last 13 years is individuals benefit from it, companies benefit from it, and now countries benefiting from it. And the fear, uncertainty, and doubt will come from the fiat thinkers that are looking at the short-term price. But remember, short-term bear markets are great opportunities to take fiat currencies and invest it into digital hard sound money, or sound money if you're a bit more conservative and want to preserve your wealth rather than speculate a bit greater and increase wealth if the demand goes up over time. So a lot of coverage there, but all I see at the moment is attacks on people's ability to achieve financial freedom, attacks on freedom of speech, and the quite right attacks on colonial attacks against the colonial attacks of the International Monetary Fund. So back to the article. Let me give you the real information, Bloomberg and Business Insider. Firstly, there is hundreds of millions waiting to invest. Why is it waiting at the moment? Well, firstly, it's a bad market at the moment, but the real reason is because we're waiting for securities laws. Once those securities laws are passed, then the Bitcoin Volcano bond is ready to go. And if for any reason it doesn't, it would be because of some kind of politics around IMF debt, sovereign debt, and something that is being done as a colonial attack. And the securities laws were delayed because there were challenges that the country needed to resolve around some of the crimes that are happening right now. And the biggest crime that the president of El Salvador, I think, should be focused on is removing economic hitmen and gangsters like the IMF from lending it more money and allowing that to get in the way of being more innovative, protecting sovereignty, and living up to the promise that you have started to live up to for the El Salvadorians and allow legal tender to persist, allow countries to engage that are financially excluded in financial inclusion by providing internet, and those with internet connected devices are able to transact like companies, and in countries using the power of Bitcoin to experiment. It is an experiment because these are new financial innovation. We created the first Bitcoin bond in 2014, but this is the first time that it's being done as a corporate sovereign, a corporate bond backed by a nation state to build infrastructure. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. So once those securities laws are released, then obviously the focus should be on removing the economic hitman and colonial attacks as a result of not having digital hard sound money being used as legal tender, not just for the people, not just for the companies, but also for the countries. So as long as YouTube allows me, as long as Twitter allows me, I will continue to release information for you to think outside the box, understand, think between the weeds of the attacks on freedoms, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and everything that is being spread in these times of uncertainty. I believe that they should have a platform to spread fake news, and I should have a platform to be able to combat it with what I believe to be the truth, and then history can judge us and tell us what exactly happened. So my goal was to be published. I've been working on my new book, written a lot of chapters. I want to get that out this year. It was over a decade since I wrote the book, Bang to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust, which I launched at the first Bitcoin conference in 2011. And those that read that book got to invest in the highest performing asset class in history, while they understood concepts that are only being talked about now, like modern monetary theory, metaverses, financial technology, fintech, and many other things that were covered in that book. If you would like a free copy of that, by the way, the old one, then head over to retirementplanb.com/book. You can get a digital copy of it. Still as relevant today. One of the things I really underestimated was the importance of privacy, but everything else I think you'll find turned out to be pretty accurate. And those that implement it were protected over the last decade. Also in that same place, you can get a 4th-part video series on investing and how I'm investing in the Great Depression of the 2020s that I released before this. Many of the depressive events started, and a complete masterclass on building and protecting your wealth in these times. So always remember, no matter how bad it gets, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get hurt. Some are going to do really well. Subscribe to this channel, like this channel, share this channel, hit the bell symbol, hit all. YouTube will notify you as more information comes through, and I will update you. If you know anyone else that would benefit from this, then we are here to seek financial freedom. And we're going to be doing it with peace. We're going to be doing it love. We're going to be doing it with unity. So I will see you in the next video. Share it with them, and I'll see them in the next video. Peace.